excited traveling with me from Indiana. Many of you may or may not know, the last couple of years I did a shift transition. I was at Ohio State for many years, but now I'm actually teaching at Indiana University. IU in Bloomington. We're having a great time there, but I was blessed. One of my graduate students is traveling with us. She's going to be helping us out with the Gospel Fest, and that's Azusa Movement. We're so glad. You get to hear her. If not, before the weekend, you might get to hear her tonight. We'll see what happens. But at any rate, we're certainly glad to have her with us, and just keep that name in your mind, because you may hear it a little bit later. And she has music ed roots too, undergraduate music ed, but has been doing some really great performing on operas and all that kind of stuff in the last couple of years. So we're excited about what will come forth with her career as well. But certainly glad to be here. Now, as we begin to talk about what we want to do tonight, when we start talking about the notion of teaching and performing in the gospel style, what we can do is vast. It is just like this. And when I was talking to Dr. Whitehead and Rebecca about, well, what do people want to learn? They threw out 50, subjects. And I said, well, you know what? We can deal with any of those subjects in the time that we have. So what I did for you, the packet that you have in your hand, for those who have one, I literally thought of about 6 or 7 different notions or different aspects of teaching or performing in the gospel style. And I can certainly do an introduction and an overview as it relates to the history, but certainly beyond that, we can kind of take a poll and see where your interests lie, because I would certainly like to give you tools to put in your tool belt that you can take with you. And the one thing you want to know about gospel music is that it is really not just a gift, but it really is a skill. And while many people have grown up in the African-American black church and they've been exposed to this music, there are some things about it that really, upon analysis, you realize are just some skills. So what we've done over the last 25 to 30 years is to look at the music, analyze it, and try to put it in a format that allows it to be accessible to those, especially who do not come from this tradition. So we're going to try to give you anything we want, or anything you want that we think will build you, or that you think will build you. And we've got some options. So if you're looking on that first sheet, you see some things there. We're going to definitely deal a little bit with the history of African-American gospel music, so you get a sense of the context in which this music is placed. Then we can look at singing in the gospel style, some of the tips that you can do to try to create the authentic sound. Then we can look at the notion of perhaps maintaining vocal health. Many of you know that's often an issue in singing gospel music. How do you maintain good health and you finish the concert with the voice left? Yes? How do you do that? Then we can even look at the notion of conducting in the gospel style. We can look at the notion of vocal improvisation. How do you do that and how that works? We can even look at playing the piano in the gospel style. So it's loads of things we can do. So what I've done is I've put a 2 to 3 page lecture handout on all of those topics in that packet. So what you have is a resource that not only will work for you today as we go through, but hopefully something you can put on your shelf and you can refer back to. Now, most of the books that the resources from which they come are manuals. One thing that we did for many years, I was blessed to teach the choral methods classes at Ohio State. And one thing that I found, especially for our students, where everybody dreamed of going to the wonderful suburban school with a budget and kids who took private lessons all of their lives. That's not where they were sent. More often than not, they were sent to urban inner city schools where kids had never had any exposure to music, where they had never experienced Bach or Beethoven and didn't care about Bach or Beethoven. And our students were not being equipped with the tools to be able to share in other musical styles. So we put together a little manual, tips on teaching vocal parts to gospel choirs, teaching our kids how to teach by rote. The schools that many of them went to didn't have budgets. They couldn't buy music. So what do you teach your choir when you have no sheet music? How do you teach them when you don't have any sheet music? And the notion of teaching by rote is indeed a skill. Gospel music is often transmitted that way, but it's a skill. So there is a manual, a book that we have that we did not bring them for you to get them, but anyway, it can be available. It's called Tips on Teaching Vocal Parts to Gospel Choirs. There are a couple other books. We have another one is How to Play by Ear. technique book on showing you how to sit down and figure out how to pull out those songs. And that seems almost oxymoronic, you know, how to play by ear with a technique book. But anyway, we're showing you the technique on how to do that. There's a book 1 and book 2. We also have another book called Vocal Training for the Gospel Singer 1, and another one is a Vocal Training for the Gospel Singer 2. Primarily as a result of my experiences in both the classical world and the gospel world, I realized that there's some good things on both sides of this fence. And while many years ago there were always these battles and fights about which world you should belong to, I had to struggle about which world I wanted to be in. And I continued to struggle because I wanted to be in both. And as a result of understanding the good things in both of those worlds, we tried to pull those things together and help each other. So there was something about the vocal health and the pedagogy and all those things that come from the European classical side, but there's something about the passion and the joy of singing that comes from the African aesthetic, that when you pull these things together, it really makes for some wonderful singing and some wonderful music making. So at any rate, the technique that we put together is one that's really teaching traditional European bel canto technique, but showing you how to apply that to gospel singing so you can maintain vocal health. So that is there. And then there's another book that we have called Interpreting the Gospel Score, where you notice when you hear a gospel song on the radio, you get excited about it, and then you go and get your sheet music, and you sit down and play it and go, this doesn't sound like the stuff that I heard on the radio. So basically, giving you an idea and a way to look at those scores, how you can interpret them, how you can add to them, and you can change and make the music what it should be. And then showing you then how to put together all those tools that you're getting here in school, like transcribing and music theory and ear training and all those things that we think are just a boring class I got to take. But in this instance, it may be a wonderful skill that you can begin to apply to literally hear any song that you want, transcribe it, put it together, and go out and teach. So the idea is the lectures, the notes that you have are excerpts from these books. So it's a whole lot more that go with them, but I tried to pull basic nuggets so that you all can have some resource to take with you, and you can have something that, you know, later you can refer to, and hopefully will help you as you go down the road. Now, let me tell you a little bit about how I got here, and then we'll talk a little about the history, and then we'll see exactly what you guys want to do. In terms of my connection to gospel music, I'm actually a 4th generation musician. My great-grandmother was a musician. Her husband was a pastor. They had 6 daughters, 4 of which were musicians and 2 of which were ministers. Well, one of those was my grandmother, and she had 3 children. My mother was a musician, and my mother then married my father, and they had 6 kids. So there were 3 older children, and my 3 older brothers and sisters were singing as a trio before we were ever born. So as soon as I could talk, I was put into the family singing group. So at 3 years old, I started singing. I always say our group was like a family group, was like a kind of gospel Jackson 5. You can imagine that during the 60s and 70s. And literally, just like Jackson 5, we traveled, we toured, we recorded, we did all of this stuff. And the wonderful thing in terms of the relation to gospel music, my great aunt, her name was Pauline Rose Lewis, was a pioneering radio announcer in the 40s and 50s. And of course, if you know anything about the history, you know that that's when gospel music was evolving as a new musical style. Well, it wasn't accepted in churches. So the one way that the people were able to do the music is that they went up on the road and developed what they called the gospel highway. And the gospel highway was a network of churches and buildings and homes and houses where people could go and stay and perform all over the country. Well, my aunt was a promoter. And as a gospel promoter, literally, she promoted the concerts of all of these new and upcoming artists. Artists like Mahalia Jackson, Thomas Dorsey, Rosetta Tharpe, the Caravans, the Mighty Clouds of Joy, Shirley Caesar, you name them. So every weekend, primarily, because my family sang, we would sing on concerts opening up for all of these groups. So we traveled pretty much Friday after school to Sunday midnight. We were on the road traveling somewhere singing, and we sang with these people all the time. And as kids, it was just people. You know, it's like, just can't believe it, whatever, you know. But later realizing in hindsight that we were a significant part of this history that was evolving. So I began singing at 3, I began playing around 4. I started composing around 9 years old. Started playing for church at 12, had my first record by 15, had my first album by 17, and with all this music decided I'm not going into music. Because of course, you know, they say if you go into music, you'll be broke. Get a real career. So I'm like, okay, I'll get a real career. I'm going to be an anesthesiologist. So I go to the Health Madness High School in my city. I was raised in Baltimore, Maryland, and I'm going to make a lot of money. At that point, back in the 70s, they were making $100,000 a year. That was a long time ago. They made a lot more now. But at any rate, I decided I'm going to make money. And they had a program at my school where they allowed the students to actually begin working in the hospitals, even as high school students. It only took me about 2 minutes to the hospital. It's like, you know what? I don't even like the smell of the hospital. This is over. I am not doing this. So I was out of the hospital and then down to the performing arts department, got bit by the bug, started studying classical music, fell in love with that music, and I decided I'm going to school for music. So I go to school for music, and I get there, and I quickly find that gospel music and classical music do not mix. In fact, there have been these ongoing fights for many issues. Some related to issues of vocal health. Some related to the issue that people were not aware of the style, and the style was not included in the curriculum. There were many, many issues. But as a result of trying to be both a classical musician and a gospel musician, it burned into me a vision that there needs to be a place where people can learn about African American gospel music in academic settings and not be made to feel it's inferior to any other musical style. So for the last 25 to 30 years, I have been active in developing methodology and pedagogy and finding ways to teach people how to access this music so that they can share in the joy of the music. So that's what we've been doing. Went back, got our master's, got our doctorate, and we were invited to begin a class at The Ohio State University. Through their School of Music. That went really well. We were then invited back to our undergraduate alma mater at Denison University to develop courses there. And just in the last 3 years, we made a shift from Ohio to Indiana, and we're now teaching at IU. And so we're serving at IU, and they have a wonderful division there called the African American Arts Institute that is devoted to just the proliferation of African American music and art. So they've got 3 performing ensembles, the African American Choral Ensemble that I'm the conductor or director for. Anastasia is my graduate assistant there for that choral ensemble. They've got a dance company, and they've got a group called the Soul Review. So at any rate, I am able now in the academic setting to begin to share this music, and that's a bit of my story. In starting from just gospel group and moving through the academy and coming to a place that now we're sharing this music. And I'm so excited about sharing it, so excited about what you're doing. And literally, let me just commend you here at Ithaca again. I remember even the first time coming. This is not a small thing that you have a gospel festival going on and that the orchestra is playing and that it's 10 years. You know, that's really, really significant. And whether or not you understand what's going on right now, when you get to start teaching and you're teaching and you need some other tools and you think back, you know, we had the opportunity to play in the orchestra that played some gospel, or we had the opportunity to sing with Dr. Galvan who made us sing some of those African songs and those spirituals and those other, you know, those will be some invaluable lessons that you will be very, very grateful for. So I am so excited about what you're doing and what Ithaca is doing to create this space for you. Also excited to see this group over here who has come from the community. Again, lifelong music learners and participants. So glad that you're here. And you well know you're here because you enjoy this music as well. So excited that we've come together, and hopefully we can make some great music together and do something today that will leave us excited as well. Now let's talk really briefly. For about 5 minutes, we can do the warp speed. I'm already on warp speed. The warp speed on the and then we can move from there into some other things that you want to do. So, what is gospel music? What is gospel music? Candace, what is that? Any thoughts? What is gospel music?
Good news.
The good news. Okay, that sounds good. What else? Any thoughts? Any other thoughts? Okay, the good news is fine. We'll go with that. All right. Are gospel songs and spirituals the same?
No.
No?
They can do it.
No? I'm just asking.
No.
All right. Well, let's move from there. Let's start with that. All right, first of all, we'll talk about gospel music. Let's define it. When you look at the definition, look for the definition of gospel music, you're going to find 3 recurring definitions in the dictionary. One is any song that contains that gospel message of Jesus Christ. You'll find that there. Then you'll find a definition that says 19th century white hymnody. Then you'll find a third definition that says an African American sacred music genre that developed in the late 1920s and 30s when African American blues and jazz artists came back to the church and began combining blues and jazz music and rhythms with the spirituals and hymns of the church. Well, that's the definition and the genre that we're going to focus on tonight. But very interestingly, when we talk about what gospel music is, people tend to clump all African American sacred music into the same category. And they assume that it's all the same. So they say, sing me a gospel song, and they mean a spiritual. Or sing me a spiritual, and they mean a gospel song. But when you begin to look at African American sacred music, there are 7 distinct African American sacred genres. And they are these. There's psalmody. There's line singing. There is shake note singing. There are spirituals. There is hymnody. There's gospel music, and then there's standard classical art forms in which African Americans compose. So there's 7 different genres, and I believe that really there's an 8th one about to come forth. In the last 10 years or so, there's been a move of what we call praise and worship music. But I don't mean praise and worship as the notion of music that elevates praise to God, but there was a whole different move going on that it's not just a type of devotional piece, it's a whole genre of music that is moving amongst the young community in a different way than the regular kind of devotional opening service music that we think of. So at any rate, something is brewing, but they're distinct African American sacred genres. So when we know those things, that helps us then to define a distinction between the music. Now, the reason that they're often confused is because all of these musical genres share common musical elements. They all will use the pentatonic scale. They all may use flatted notes. They all may use syncopation. They all may use call and response. But they may use them in a different way. And what you'll find, there's slight little things that make distinction between one and the other. For example, if you think of psalmody and line singing, the primary difference is they perform the same way. Someone would recite the line, and they would come and sing memorized tunes. But psalmody was just the scriptures of the Bible. Line singing had personalized text. So that's one of the distinctions as you begin to hear them. When you begin to look at, for example, quartet music and gospel music. When you say, I sing with the quartets, don't you dare tell a quartet person they're a gospel singer. Or don't you dare tell a gospel person they're a quartet singer. Well, what's the difference? They're all singing the same text, right? Well, actually, originally as the music was formed, gospel music, accompaniment-wise, was for SAT, soprano, alto, tenor, choir, and the accompaniment was piano, organ, bass, and drums. The quartets were for TTBB. All the men sang in the quartets, and the accompaniment was guitars. It's bass guitar, rhythm guitar, lead guitar, and drums. So the way you can distinguish them is by the instrumentation and the performing force. So while those are little tiny things, those little differences were the things that distinguish each of these various styles. So you can go through each one of the genres and see the little distinctions that way. But what I'm trying to share is that there is a distinction between gospel music and the other types of African American sacred music. Now, when we start talking about gospel music, we must know that while gospel is different and distinguished from the spiritual, it is connected to the spiritual. The gospel music, in fact, is a grandchild of the spiritual. Many scholars suggest that the spiritual is one of the first authentic American musics to evolve here in this country on this soil. And that's why it's become so significant, and it is so significant. But as the spiritual evolved, it evolved in at least 5 different directions that really began to shape the music of America. Well, the spiritual evolved in a secular direction. It went from the spiritual to become the blues. And if you look at the original blues in the original form, it is the same format as the spiritual in terms of antecedent, consequent, phrase, and everything. The primary difference was the spiritual focused on telling your problems to God, while the blues focused on telling your problems to man. So there was a difference. But the blues, as it continued to evolve, it went into jazz, it went into ragtime, it even went into rock. It even went into rock and roll. Like, what? The spiritual? How do you get there? Well, when blues evolved, it began to move north into different areas of the country and develop into what we call the classic blues. The classic blues is basically the 12-bar blues. You know, you've all heard it, you all know it. All right, so when you hear that, you begin to say, what's the blues? Give me a line. Give me a blues line. Give me something. Summertime. I need some what? It's summertime.
I'm so tired and weary.
I'm so tired and weary. It's summertime and I'm so tired and weary. All right, okay. It's summertime and I'm so tired and weary. Oh, it's summertime and I'm so tired. first line is your A line. The second line is your A line repeated. So that's what your problem is. And the third line, your B line, is your resolution. What you're going to do about it, how you feel about it, what is your resolve about that problem. Well, they took that and they said, okay, let's take the blues. Right, so the idea, all right. So now you got rock and roll. But then you get rock. Now they use guitars. Right? But you don't think of the spiritual when you think of rock and roll, or when you think of rock, right? But that comes out of that secular line. Then it evolved a theatrical direction. Many of you may be aware of a practice called minstrelsy. Minstrelsy was a practice where white performers would paint their face in blackface, and they would do performances imitating the slaves. Now, the irony of minstrelsy is that there was a point where the slaves were not permitted to sing their own music. And while they were unable to sing their music, those minstrel singers continued to keep their music alive while they were not permitted to sing their own music. But minstrelsy then turns into vaudeville, which then turns into musical theater, right? So you don't think of the spiritual when you begin to think of that line, but that's connected. Then it went in artistic direction. Many of us, when we study history, of course you guys have, classical and Baroque and Renaissance and all these other eras. But when we get to the 18th century, 19th century actually, we get to Romantic period, and we start thinking about a music called art music. We start thinking about the art songs. And of course, during that period, there were composers like Schumann and Schubert and others who were taking the poetry of wonderful poets and setting these poems to music. And they would use what we call word painting. They would try to create a visual image to the music and set these wonderful songs. Well, at the same time, there was a composer, a Czech composer named Dvorak, who came to America, and he began working with a man by the name of Harry Burleigh, who was an African-American composer of spirituals and classical art composer as well. But at any rate, they had the idea, why not take the spiritual and use it as a source for art songs? So then they took the spiritual and created the art song spiritual for the concert stage. And for many people, they don't realize that even during the days of slavery, many of the slaves were very gifted and talented, that their masters paid for them to be trained, and they performed all over the world. You think of like Frank Williams, you think of Elizabeth Greenfield, and all these who were opera singers, but they were slaves. But they sang in that beautiful bel canto style. And then later on, you get the spiritual coming to the concert stage. Now, the primary difference is the oral spiritual in the field was sung in the rough, the coarse, harsh tones. Ah, there's a balm in Gilead, the hills is sing, oh, there's a balm in Gilead, to make the wounded whole. All right? Then, you transform that. There's a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. There's a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul. So that same spiritual that they were singing in the field, all of a sudden, they're singing on the concert stage. And they add piano accompaniment and orchestral accompaniment, and you get the art song spiritual. So that's the third direction. But then it went in an academic direction. After Emancipation Proclamation, there were two trends of thought in the African American community. One trend said, look, now that we are free, let's go back and do things like we did it in Africa, with the emotion and the drums and the movement and the dance. Let's do it because we're free. Now the other mindset says, now that we are free, we must demonstrate that we're equal to our white counterparts, and we must do everything according to the European aesthetic. So at that point, the historical black colleges and universities were established. And believe it or not, they were established to help African Americans fit into European culture and society. And in many of those universities, they did not welcome anything related to Africa or the various Africanisms. So, such university, Fisk University, they were in need of funding and money, so they had the idea, let's put together a choir, take them out on the road singing classical music and raise money for the school. Well, they went out singing the traditional repertoire and didn't make as much money as they hoped. One day they were sitting around singing some of the old spirituals, and somebody said, why not put those on the concert? Like, nobody wants to hear that old music from the slave days now, forefathers and grandparents. Nobody wants to hear that old music. Well, the story goes that they were singing for Congregationalist ministers in Oberlin, Ohio. And they were just singing their traditional rep, and people were just talking and not paying any attention. And all of a sudden, they started singing some of the spirituals. And the room got quiet. And the people were so moved by the singing of those spirituals that they raised more than $20,000 on that tour. And that was in 1871. So for the next 10 years, they raised more than $150,000 singing these spirituals. And what they did was, they went back and they got the oral spiritual, but combined it with European choral harmonies and developed what we call the concert spiritual. So for all of you that have sung spirituals before with sheet music in high school and choir, that's the formal or concert spiritual, but that comes out of that line. And even to this day, in many communities, during spring break, the black college choirs will still travel and tour all over the country raising money for their schools, and that goes back to that tradition. Well, Fisk Jubilee singers, having done that, raised a lot of money, everyone else imitated them. And most every HBCU, historical black college university, had a resident arranger that was arranging spirituals, and they were singing them all over the world. Well, they realized, well, we're no longer original, because everybody's doing this. So what can we do now? Well, then they went back to the drawing board and started a male quartet. The male quartet, like the Jubilee singers, also became so popular that everybody began to imitate them. So as the students graduated, they went back to their homes and everybody had a quartet. The Porters Union had a quartet, the bricklayers had a quartet, the cement layers had a quartet, everybody had a quartet. Who else had a quartet? Who else do you think? The barbershop folks had a quartet. Now when you think of barbershop quartet, you don't generally think African American, and you definitely do not trace it back to the spiritual. But if you go back and look at the origins of this musical form, it comes right out of that line. In fact, a tip for you, there was a company called Document Records. Go to documentrecords.com, and they have acquired ownership to all the original cylinders and recordings of African American quartets and blues and jazz artists from the 1880s up to 1920. So I warn you, when you go to the website, have your credit card ready, or just, restrain yourself, because there's so much wonderful music. But they have recordings of African American quartets from the 1880s, and the Fisk Jubilee singers and the quartets. It's wonderful, but that comes right out of that spiritual line. So where does the gospel come from? So the spiritual evolved in secular direction, in theatrical direction, an artistic direction, an academic direction, but then it evolved in a sacred direction. Well, when we talked about that group that wanted to go back to Africa, or the African way, they didn't want to worship in a way that was very intellectual and reserved. They wanted to worship with the emotion. So around 1900s and after Emancipation Proclamation, this group said, you know what? We want some excitement and energy. So they developed a different kind of church. They developed what we call the storefront church. There was a movement in 1906 called the Azusa Movement. And it was a movement led by a preacher and a pastor who believed that the Holy Spirit could descend on people and they could speak in tongues and healings could occur just like the first century church. Well, at any rate, that eventually happened, and the movement became so exciting that people came from all over the world. And from that movement, all the Pentecostal apostolic denomination churches were formed. But because it was so exciting, they needed an exciting music to match the era, the fit of the movement. And where they turned again was to the spiritual. But this time, they added instruments like piano and bass and drums and organ and small percussion. And they began to sing songs that everyone could be a part. They sang songs like this. This new light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Come on, sing with me. This new light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This new light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. And they developed what we call the congregational spiritual. Now, in these little churches, understand that there were African Americans who had significant wealth, who were highly educated, who were able to build their own churches and facilities even in the 1800s. But for these smaller communities that wanted to worship in this way, they were former slaves who came from the South, and they couldn't afford that. So they would find any place they could worship. And even to this day, if you go down into urban, rural communities, you'll see little buildings, and there'll be a sign outside that says it's a church. And they're called storefront churches. Well, in these churches, because they were right in the midst of the community, they had many things going on. So 5 musical things came together. They began to adopt the white hymnody that was relevant to their community. They began to develop what they call black hymnody. They would transform it by adding elements of the African aesthetic. They began to sing the congregational spirituals. They began to sing the quartet music. And then the other thing that came in was blues and jazz. So how did blues and jazz get into the church? Well, as we shared, these folks could not afford to hire the musicians who were just formally trained and, with all the accolades. They couldn't afford that. So they would take whoever was willing. So guess who was willing to play? Those folks who were playing in the clubs Monday through Saturday. They came in church on Sunday. And they didn't check their blues and jazz at the door. They came right on in and started putting that to that music. And the next thing you know, there was a new form of music called gospel music. So as you begin to look at that history, now we see that gospel is connected to the spiritual. It is in fact a grandchild of the spiritual. So they are connected. And it's a wonderful musical style. Now where does the music go from there? And let me bring you up to date. Now here you go, the 1-minute synopsis. My doctoral dissertation was actually on the history of African American gospel music. It was entitled Defining African American Gospel Music by Tracing its Historical and Musical Development from 1900 to 2000. So we did a 100-year look at the history of African American gospel music because we were trying to determine what is gospel music. Around 2000, this young man named Kirk Franklin released a song called Stomp. And the church people went crazy. It's like, that is not gospel, that's devil music, that is awful. He's going to hell, that's awful, right? Well, at any rate, he declared it is gospel. So it prompted the question, well, what then is gospel? So as we began to look at definitions, the older definition didn't define the new stuff. The newer definition didn't account for the older stuff. So we had to go all the way back and trace the history. And in doing that, we discovered something. There was a historical pattern that exists in the history of gospel music, and it is this. Someone comes to the church with a style that's considered too secular. So the church doesn't like it, they reject it. But while they reject it, the secular world embraces it, and they make a lot of money. Can I say a lot of money? A lot of money. So the people in the church start looking at that style going, They look at the style and begin to tweak it by adding more traditional elements until it comes to the place that the church folks say, okay, we can accept this. They accept it, they take it to a peak, and then bam, it happens again. Well, that pattern has happened 5 times in the history of gospel music since its beginning. So we've got 5 different eras. We've got what we call the congregational era, from 1900 to 1920 to the present. We've got what we call the traditional era, or the golden age of gospel, from 1930 to 1960 to the present. We've got what we call the contemporary era, the 1960 to 1970 to the present. We've got what we call the word ministry era from 1980 to 1990 to the present. And we're now living in what we call an urban crossover era from 1990 to 2000 to the present. Now you notice I'm giving you 3 dates as opposed to 2, not just the beginning and the ending. Gospel music is less than 100 years old. So there's still people alive who are singing and performing in these original genres. So it is still alive, and as long as folks continue to teach and mentor and train people to perpetuate those styles, it's still working. But that helps us then to explain why the music of Thomas Dorsey doesn't sound like the music of Kirk Franklin. So there is a wonderful history, and there's so much more that we could talk about, and we're not going to. We're going to move on, and we're going to do something else, and try to find something else that we can do that will really be some good tools in your tool belt. But with that said, hopefully that gives you a sense of the history, how it's connected, and an overview and a way to kind of put it into a place. I'm so excited now that gospel music is now, more so than ever, being embraced in the academy. Not just, even ACDA, all choirs just come up, the last song they would normally do was a spiritual. But even now, choirs are ending with a gospel song, and that was like unheard of. So the idea is it's coming about. Many schools now are looking at developing gospel programs, and for accredited programs, where kids can get academic credit. So having the skill or having the fearlessness to try it maybe something else that you might be able to do as you move forward with your careers as well. So I'm excited about this. There's lots of information. We can certainly steer you in a direction if you need to get more. But know that it's a rich musical tradition. And again, I honor you, and I am just giving you all that we can for your doing this festival and for making this festival available to your community, because it's a wonderful, rich music and a rich culture and rich heritage that deserves to be shared with the world. All right, now, where do we go from here? What do you all want to do? I know there was some talk of some vocal improvisation. You want to learn how to sing and do some improv and all that kind of stuff? All right, well, this is what we will do. Let me turn my vocal improvisation notes and put on my glasses. There is a handout I believe you have in there that deals with that. Now, let's talk about this, and we're going to do some singing. What I'll do is we'll take a song that all of you know, and if you don't know, we can go back to Mary Had a Little Lamb. We know you know that. We'll take Mary Had a Little Lamb and do some difficult things with this. But the one thing, how many of you have ever done a gospel solo before, had to do a solo in gospel style? All right, good, good, good. How many of you, have desired to do it, but you were afraid to do it? Like, okay, don't get me up here, I can't do it. All right, good for you. Well, the one thing I say to you is fear not. Do not be afraid. It is something that you can do. But again, vocal improvisation is a skill. Everybody say skill. Skill. Now, while many people look at those who do it very well and you think they're just gifted, and they are, they have spent time developing the skill of performing and improvising. So, what do? I go back to your theory. Benjamin Britten, all these folks talked about improvisation, which said you develop a library of tools from which you pull. It's no different for gospel music. It's just that if you're in a certain community, the tools that you develop may not be conducive for gospel. So the idea is, if you want to improvise in the gospel style, you must learn some of those tools. Now, I'm going to teach you a very, very quick one that can get you singing immediately, but if you look at the handout that you have, there's some things that we can do. When we start talking about this, one of the primary things that's used for improvisation is the pentatonic scale. Right? Say pentatonic scale. Pentatonic scale was a 5-note African-derived scale that's used in most all of the music that came from Africa. In fact, most all of the original spirituals can be performed on just those 5 notes. Now, on the piano, it just so happens that these 5 notes reach pentatonic scale. I didn't frame it like that, but that's the pentatonic scale. So, at any rate, the idea is, when you begin to look at music and performing improvisation, that scale is one of the key passages into improvisation. When you look at, here, and listen to a lot of the music, please, here's the scale. So, that's the scale. You sing, try it with me, and. Now, good. Now, here's a run. Listen. Let's try it. 1, 2, sit up. Here we go. Good. Now, that's the pentatonic scale. We've made a run for it. We've given it something to exercise with. Most of my friends who are awesome at running, famous gospel artists, I remember sitting around, we had a conversation with an artist, Darryl Coley, Fred, another, Brenda Waters. One day we were just sitting around talking about runs. And if you knew these names, you can look them up, Darryl Coley, Brenda Waters. They are masters of vocal improvisation, masters of vocal improvisation. And we were talking about it, and they began to talk, yeah, we used to practice our runs. We'd be in the shower, and then we'd have run contests, like, okay, try this one, woo, woo, okay, try this one, woo, okay, woo, okay, well, try this one, woo, so they didn't just wake up running, they were practicing. Now, they weren't saying, well, we're going to have run practice. They were just doing it naturally because they were just trying to have some fun singing, but they were still practicing to develop a skill. And that's the same thing that you want to do. Now, when you hear singers singing, many times adding in all the improvisation, we talk about the melismatic singing. And the Lord, it's no different than, it's just melismatic singing. The same thing in How Does Messiah, you just add a couple flatted notes somewhere on the soul for some reason. So it's the same idea. So, you create patterns. Same notes. I'm creating patterns. I mean, you can create any kind of pattern you want, but it's that same pentatonic scale that you're working on that you can use to do some of